Tēnā koutou, mapuhai, assalamu alaikum, malole soifua, malole langi mama. Welcome, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for making the time to join us today for this very, very important conversation. It's a conversation that's been happening for some time in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's now reached a point where we really need urgent action. So thank you very much for all of you who've been advocating in this space, friends and allies from civil society, from the unions, and from business, as well as also colleagues in the public service who have added their voice into fighting migrant exploitation. We welcome you and thank you for joining us today. I am Saunoamaali'i, Karanina Sumeo. I am the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner here at the Human Rights Commission. And joining me today, we've got three amazing people who will be known to many of you. We have Dennis Maga, the first president of the Union Network of Migrants and the current General Secretary of First Union. We have Nassim Lelazari, Chief Commercial Officer at Working In, and a licensed immigration advisor and expert in ethical immigration practices. And we have Dayle Takitimu, our Rongomau Taketake here at the Kāhui, Tika, Tangata, the Human Rights Commission. I will give them an opportunity to introduce themselves very, very soon. But I thought, thinking about our workers, our talent, our people, whose lives are impacted by migrant exploitation, I found a quote that I wanted to share with you today to open our session, and it goes like this. The people who get on in this world are the people who get up and look for the circumstances they want, and if they can't find them, make them. And so it has occurred to me that some of our people who have come to serve the needs of Aotearoa are being penalized for dreaming, for looking for a better life for themselves and their loved ones. And that is absolutely wrong. Fundamental human rights, we have a right to be treated fairly, to be treated equally. We are born with inherent dignity. This is enshrined in a number of United Nations conventions. It's also protected in our own employment laws and local laws. And yet this continues to happen, often with knowledge and with awareness of those involved in this. So clearly we've got a significant issue, and I wanted us to start with that so that we keep the people in mind as we talk about systems and other things. So once again, welcome, and I'll now give an opportunity to each of our panelists just to briefly introduce themselves. So can I come to you, Dennis?
Kia ora tātou, mabuhay. I am Dennis Maga. I'm the General Secretary of First Union. And I was also the founder of the Union Network of Migrants. And I love the topic today and happy to contribute.
Okay, Dennis. We'll come to you, Nassim.
Kia ora, hello everyone. My name is Nassim. I'm a licensed immigration advisor, registered migration agent, and I've been working with Working In for nearly 14 years. So the company that I work for, we obviously help employers look for skills, and I'm happy and proud to say that we led the way in ethical recruitment from the Philippines after the Christchurch earthquake, and some of the problems that were initially highlighted at that point in time. So I oversee a team of licensed immigration advisors that works with employers and then the migrant workers that come to New Zealand.
Thank you. And kia ora, Dayle.
Kia ora tātou. My name is Dayle Takitimu, he mokopuna hau no te tai rāwhiti. No reira me mihi kauana kia tātou, e hui hui mai nei rungi tēnei kaupapa. My name is Dayle Takitimu. I hail from the East Cape of this land of ours. I'm from the iwi of Te Whānau and I currently sit as the Rongomau Taketake, which is the Indigenous Rights Governance Partner for the Human Rights Commission. So come at things particularly from a Tiriti o Waitangi and Indigenous rights lens. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Dayle. So that's our amazing panelists. And before we go to our questions, can I just encourage everybody online? We would really appreciate any comments that you make. We want today to be another contribution to the public discourse about the issues that we're talking about. So would like to use your comments in some of the advocacy work. And also at the end of the session, there will be a very short survey. And again, I would strongly encourage and ask you please to just take a couple of minutes just to complete the survey. Again, it will give us some guidance on how to do better, but also it will just help us with our work. So if I can make those two requests of everybody online. Just a brief background on the work of the Commission around the migrant exploitation in this space since I've been here as Commissioner. In 2022, we released our report on human rights issues that arose out of an inquiry into the RSE scheme, the seasonal employment scheme. And that generally came out of findings from involving Pacific workers. The issues are very familiar to us about unconsented, unreasonable wage deductions, people paying expensive rents in places that were basically unhealthy, not having access to quality healthcare when needed, despite having deductions being taken from their pay for health insurance and so forth. And people generally felt stuck. They were in this country, they needed money to go home, but they were stuck. So there was a sense of desperation there. And so a number of human rights breaches were identified, and we reached out to engage with businesses as well as the government. And so we're awaiting the government to to make progress on the review of the RSE scheme. And recently there have been some changes that have been introduced. On one hand, it sounds positive. On the other hand, it's concerning again. For example, the minimum 30 hours of work per week has been removed. That's a little bit of a concern because meanwhile, the deductions are still happening. And from a human rights perspective, if deductions keep happening when you're not being paid enough, that will impact people's ability to have a good life, to live, and basic rights of food and so forth. So there are some issues to still address in that scheme, but we're hoping that the government will move faster on the review of it. Earlier this year, we released our report, our human rights report, the Accredited Employer Work Visa scheme in Aotearoa, the Human Rights Review. And we want to thank all of the workers who had contributed to that, who spoke out and took a lot of courage to speak out, as well as our union partners who helped facilitate some of those discussions, and individuals in civil society who have been providing support to workers. And we also thank some of our businesses. We do have fantastic businesses that are doing great work. We thank you for expressing your views on the scheme. So amongst the audience, we will have a mix of a very diverse audience today who are aware of some of the needs that we need to address. But we hope today we've got a very diverse panel for you, and we encourage them to bring in their own perspective into the discussion. So that's a little bit of background from me. So now we're going to get on to the questions. I've got some set questions for our panelists, but please feel free to put in questions. We've got a team in the background who will filter those questions and send them through, and then we'll give them to the panel. So we'll get started now with our first question. So to our panelists, what is your vision for an immigration system for migrant workers that is human-centered, upholds human rights, and particularly from your perspective, Dayle, also, that upholds the tiriti of Waitangi in Aotearoa? So I'll come to you, Dayle, first.
Kia ora, and just mahi to you for the question, because I think big vision and big aspiration is important in these spaces, particularly where New Zealand and other developed countries like to see themselves as the political kind of thought leaders in these spaces. I think it's always important to have these aspirational visions about how we can do better, as opposed to sort of cherry picking what we might be able to tinker around the edges with a system. In regards to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, I note that there are outstanding constitutional discussions to be had between tangata whenua and the New Zealand government in regards to the power inequity and a long historic hangover from Te Tiriti o Waitangi through to the modern day that are still not firmly settled in a way that Indigenous rights are respected first and foremost on this whenua. And then having an immigration system that then is juxtaposed to a correctly balanced constitutional space. So in that regard, I note in particular with Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the rights articulated in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the right of our Indigenous communities to their own territorial integrity, which of course is a big deal in international law. And with that, our ability to have a voice in the control of our own borders. At the moment, that is a task and function unilaterally assumed by the colonising government without any real Māori input into that space. And I think a future for New Zealand needs to see, one, us mature into a space where we can have that good, robust constitutional discussion, and that will also, if done properly, realign how Māori mana whenua have a say into, one, our own territorial integrity and the control of our borders, but two, our right to self-determination and our ability to express how we would like to manaaki and look after people coming into this whenua, particularly I think of our, but not limited to, but of particular reference because of the proximity, our whanaunga and our tuakana of the Pacific. There's obviously ancient alliances there that predate the coming of the British Crown and the imposition of this colonial system here that have been interrupted and disrupted by colonisation, and the ability to reset some of that through a quite robust and mature discussion would be great and is long overdue. But I think that often quoted space that a society is judged how it provides for and protects its most vulnerable is certainly applicable to New Zealand in this case. Our most vulnerable in these spaces are not well protected and not well provided for. So I think aspirationally, I'd like to see a system that has some objective monitoring, has some accessible monitoring and remedy available to people that are otherwise in a power imbalance in terms of the assertion of their rights. And that needs a lot more robust strengthening. I noted in the New Zealand government's Universal Periodic Review that came out this year from the United Nations across a range of human rights commitments the government have got. There were several recommendations specifically about improving protections for migrant workers and around the vulnerability around modern slavery and those sorts of criticisms that we may just be getting a little complacent and a little bit too relaxed, and it needs to stay at the forefront of our minds.
Kia ora, Dayle. Thank you very much for that. And I'm sure there'll be questions that will come up that will to enable that to be broadened out. Dennis, if I could come to you to answer, to talk to that same question. We know our brothers and sisters from the Philippines, India and China particularly, those are like the three big source nations of some of our workers here on the accredited work visa. So what is your vision for immigration system that upholds the rights of our migrant workers?
That's a good question. I love actually how Dayle also explained that in terms of the application of the TTT and the international connections or international humanitarian law as well. If ever you ask me about that one as a trade unionist and as also a Filipino migrant here who migrated here 18 years ago, I believe that it must be a progressive immigration system. And when you say progressive, meaning that is actually humane And it also reduces irregular migration by creating regular pathways and inclusion of decent work, which is always actually the shortcomings of any immigration policies that I've seen so far. And it also must be sustainable. And sustainable means it fully understand the country's infrastructure. And it's not only a short-term solution, but also long-term. And of course, free from exploitation. Because look, New Zealand is a destination country, and we attract a lot of nationalities out there. Um, and by looking at the different nationalities, they are also victims of exploitation. And from the information I'm seeing actually on the ground right now, aside from being a Filipino, there's so much exploitation in the South Asian community, in the Chinese community, and even the Latin Americans. We need to pay attention to that one. And that's the reason why I always ask myself that when I moved into this country 18 years ago, we've been asking the same question. And 18 years after, we're still in the same situation. Something must be done. Otherwise, we don't want to wait for another generation to be speaking in the same context and the same problem. So therefore, a progressive immigration system must be introduced. And if ever it must reset the immigration system, then so be it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dennis. It's huge. It's huge. And like you say, we don't want this to become a generational challenge. We want it to end. Can I come to you now, Nassim, as an ethical employer? I think there'll be a lot of interest in your perspective about your vision for an immigration system that is fair and decent and human-centered.
Sure, thank you. I think, the issues that, Dayle mentioned that need to be addressed and worked through aside, I think if we were to have a system that took all the parties that are a part of it into consideration and they were consulting and they were looking at, how they could work together to get the best outcomes, that's where we would have a really good, robust system or program that would work. I think it's important for us to also acknowledge that in today's day and age, we have aging populations. And so we do have this reliance and this ongoing need for migrants to be a part of our society and our economy. So we need to be considering, these what can appear to be conflicting sort of goals and aspirations to ensure that we're getting the outcome that works for everybody and all parties. So whether it's the employer, the individual migrant worker and their families, or Aotearoa itself. So if the three parties were to be, if it was a little bit more of a consultative process, a true one, I think we would have better outcomes, and one where we all acknowledge that one party doesn't need to suffer for the other to do better. And I think a lot of what we see today and a lot of the laws and some of the changes that we have passed at the moment is one person or one party having to make a concession, whereas I'm of the belief that there's always a solution and everyone can do better. We just probably haven't talked about it properly enough.
Yeah, thank you. It is. I mean, when we're talking about migrant exploitation, it's like you say, it's a whole chain. It's what's happening in the host nation and then what's happening here as well as what's happening in the workplace. So you do have the different parties, so many people involved, and coming together makes, it makes perfect sense. We need the transparency as well as accountability. So thank you for that, Nassim. So focusing now more closely at the Accredited Employment Work Visa specifically, can I start with you, Dennis? Can you tell us a bit more about the exploitation that you're seeing, some examples of the exploitation that you're seeing in Aotearoa as a result of that scheme in its current form?
Yeah. What I can do is to put a proper background and context as well. And the context will be beginning COVID 2020 and post-COVID period. What we have seen so far are the following. There are so many premiums. So meaning premium means that they have to pay for their own job. All right. In order to create a job offered, some of them pay 20 grand, some of them 30 grand. It's so ridiculous in order for them to get a residency. And some of them benefited from the one-off residency because of that. The second one, there are so many underpayment or non-payment of wages from different employers. I've seen this in the construction industry and hospitality, and we're scratching our head about, how come that these things are happening? And what were the roles of the labor inspectors to make sure that this is not happening? It's massive, the way I see it. And then there's also a scheme about pay your own tax. So in order to meet the median wage, some of them, there is an arrangement that you have to pay for your own tax. And the way they are doing it is that by reimbursing the employer. And then I also heard stories about migrants are actually being asked by their employers to do a grocery shopping for them every week. And that's how they refund the median wage requirement. And then there are also some immigration advisors who also abuse their jobs by also asking premium. But there are many good ones that don't get me wrong. But I think there are a couple of them that should be actually held accountable and should be criminalized for this kind of exercise. And the last thing that I can actually describe in terms of exploitation is that there are some hustlers in the industry that once they form an entity and they already actually profited from that entity, then there's a practice of phoenixing. They liquidate their business. And once you liquidate their business, it's going to be hard to chase these employers. And I've been saying this to previous government and this government as well. We have to introduce a legislation that will not simply penalize an individual director, but they will be prevented to establish their own business. The problem is that they introduced a couple of policies or legislation, but in order for them not to continue as a director, they must be convicted. But it's really hard if ever you actually pursue cases against them, because it will take ages before it can be proven that they are guilty of such cases. So phoenixing is still a problem, and I'm hoping and I'm praying that there will be a government who can actually address this problem in the future.
Thank you, Dennis. There's a lot there. And I'm just wondering, your first point about premiums, this is something that we also found in our inquiry here at the Human Rights Commission. I wonder if, Nassim, if we could come to you as an ethical employee, if you've got any comments around the premiums, but also your general response to that question about what are you seeing around migrant exploitation involved in the scheme?
So I think, exactly what Dennis said, we had this pent-up demand, it sort of all came to a head, and, there were individuals who took advantage of that. And I talk about how some companies were set up as $2 shelf companies. They brought all these people in that they'd basically convinced to pay for jobs that didn't exist. And then, as Dennis noted, they shut down, liquidate, and they disappear with all the funds, leaving the poor migrants to figure out what's next. I think one thing that I always ask is, if it doesn't cost you to recruit or to do business, then you should be asking why. And so that's where those premiums come into, I think, is what the is an easy to identify issue. So I guess I have the luxury of working with bigger employers who, generally have budgets and funds put aside for recruitment and pay for things. But across, along the way, some of these employers will say, oh, there's someone else who will help us recruit people for less. And so you think, well, why? How is it possible when we know that things cost so much that suddenly there isn't a cost to you? If you're not paying it, who is? And that's when you should be asking the question and looking back and saying, well, if I as the employer am not having to pay a recruitment fee, I don't have to even employ staff to do that, no one's checking references, I'm not paying for their visa or their flight, who's paying for all that? And, someone who has a little bit of discretion or, would be able to clearly identify that it's the individual is paying that to somebody somewhere along the line. And so that's a really easy way to identify that perhaps your recruitment processes are not robust and they're not great. And so, and I appreciate that at the moment, you can pop an ad up on the internet and you'll get thousands of applicants in some roles, but in others, it's still not as easy. But at the, last year, when some of this first came to light, there was a skill shortage, there was a desperate need for people. And so some roles were genuine and employers were getting access to people quite easily, which was unusual, and they should have been asking why. And then you had others who were creating false companies, false jobs, and then individuals were quite desperate to come to New Zealand for various reasons, and that vulnerability was taken advantage of. And sometimes, I mean, Dennis talked about people paying 20, 30,000. We had an individual come to our office here who sat across the table from me and told me he'd paid an agent 70,000 New Zealand dollars for a job that he admitted he knew didn't exist. So you know that people want to come to New Zealand. And so if we can't control what happens offshore, we need to be better at controlling what happens here, so we're not encouraging this exploitation.
Thank you very much, Nassim. It is so complex. There's so many players, and it's, I mean, one of the things, I mean, as Dayle mentioned in her opening remarks, we have been calling for modern slavery. We've got, some of our trading partners recommending to New Zealand to have specific modern slavery legislation because it's so complex. And the whole cross-border, the transnational element is really significant, as we all know. I mean, where do you even start with that? So, yeah, it's very, very complex. Dayle, have you got any comments? Because I know that you're connected to some of our iwi businesses. Is there anything that they're seeing around the scheme, the issues around the scheme?
I think probably from an iwi business point of view, less familiarity with the ins and outs of the scheme, and the hurdles that need to be sort of jumped through, or the technicalities of those things, and more the sort of grassroots reality that there are often now almost overnight spring up within iwi territories, groups of migrant workers that have been that are annexed to different industry, primarily horticultural industry here in the Bay of Plenty, who there's horror stories come out of some of those experiences that people, I think, would be surprised to learn occur in a country like New Zealand. And they're surprised because it largely happens out of sight and out of mind from a lot of the mainstream sort of public scrutiny or the media. And there's not obviously a lot of advocacy when you're coming from a power imbalance that doesn't enable you to have that advocacy into getting some public exposure on things. So we, within my iwi of Te Whānau Apanui, primarily experienced that through the kiwi fruit industry, where we have regularly workers being housed in substandard housing, cold, wet, mouldy. They're being charged excessive amounts for that housing against their wages. They are limited in terms of transportation. They're often accommodated in really remote, isolated places where the men and the women are separated by a huge geographic space, despite, some of them being married and grown adults and things like that, very much treated like children by these employers, who then have them over a barrel in terms of allowances that come out of their wages before they even see them. First of all, a lot not even really on a living wage. And then getting money deducted for, I think we saw some that were, they had money deducted for caravan rental, where they were being accommodated in these cold, blustery caravans in the middle of winter down in a coastal community. They had no ready access to shops or facilities. They were being charged a $10 a week blanket fee for sort of spit through duvet you could get from down at the warehouse. And very restricted, no ability to advocate for their rights because of the power the employers held. When the iwi went to step in to sort of say, hang on, what's going on here? The employers very quickly tried to shut us down and say, this is none of your business. Like, this is don't get involved. We were involved by nature of the fact that this was in our territory, and whether they liked it or not, we were going to see if we could step up by way of some manaakitanga and make sure these whanaunga of ours were properly housed, they were warm, they could get access to kaimoana, those sorts of things. I think one of the issues that I have around the whole kaupapa that we're talking about too is this misconstruing of this benevolence of New Zealand to extend this open door or not, or these conditions for entry, and no real acknowledgement of the value and contribution that migrant workers make to our economy. And New Zealand's economy is reliant in a large extent on the ability of migrant and skilled workers to prop that up. And instead of acknowledging that and seeing, therefore, that those sectors should be properly represented in political debate and those sorts of things and law reform, instead it's sort of downplayed as this, New Zealand is benevolently allowing you this sort of limited scope of rights. And I think that's highly problematic because it doesn't accurately reflect how much contribution and really exploitation New Zealand has in regards to Pacific and Asian countries coming in and nationals coming into this country. And I think that languaging is a maintenance of power that is not appropriate.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dayle. You remind me of some of our findings when we spoke to some of the RSE workers. The sense of just be grateful. Be grateful you're in New Zealand. Be grateful you've got a job. And you just be grateful for what you're being paid because it's much more than what you'd be paid if you were, back home. Like all of that sort of guilt tripping that's thrown on top, the psychological abuse and exploitation, in addition to the financial exploitation. And, it did raise a concern for me at one point around the issue of racial discrimination in the treatment of certain workers as commodities, as people. I think there was an article by one of our academics, paying to be a modern slave. That's how it felt to them. That they had contributed, and they've ended up in this place, and they felt like slaves to other humans. So thank you very much for bringing that element in. I mean,
And
New
I
Zealand,
think in that regard, that's an embarrassment for New Zealand, and it should be an embarrassment, but it's also inaccurate. It's not accurate in terms of how much benefit New Zealand derives from this arrangement in this relationship. And I don't think it's sustainable going forward into a future where we would expect to do better in regards to human rights.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Dennis, you mentioned before the role of labor inspectorates. So recruiters bring in people and then they go to their workplaces, and there's an expectation that the state still has a duty to our migrant workers, whether or not they're citizens. So the labor inspectors doing their job. Can you talk a little bit perhaps about how the state's role could be improved?
Yeah. Look, when I attended the International Labor Conference 2017 in Geneva, we've been discussing about the enforcement and the role of labor inspectors. But there's one commonality, and the commonality is that no matter how many legislations you introduce, as long as you don't have enough adequate people or subjective forces to implement them, it's not going to happen. Because people are not going to voluntarily take themselves into prison or be accountable for what they have done. The number of labor inspectors, every time there's a new government, our job as a trade union is always ask, how many labor inspectors are you going to employ today? I am sad that this government is now reducing the number of public sector employees. because it's actually the other way around. We would like to see more resources being put into, because what do you expect from minimal number of labor inspectors if ever there's a growing number of exploitation happening around? And this is not just simply an isolated cases. Look, and I can start, for example, from AEWV. The scheme, that idea of that scheme was actually good. In fact, I was part of the consultative body of MBIE before they introduced this concept of accreditation. And we've been saying to the government that accreditation is a good way to monitor the movement of employers when employing migrants. And that will be the entry point of labor inspectors. The problem with AEWV, it became a tick-in-the-box exercise. And one thing that we found out by engaging with our colleague from Public Services Association, other unions, the government did not employ enough people actually to process the AEWV application. So if ever you don't have enough resources, then these people are just simply processing that under the pressure from the bureaucracy. So it's not going to work. So the same problem, if ever there is not enough labor inspectors, we've been saying to the government, employ more labor inspectors. The other one is that aside from employing labor inspectors, give them more power to investigate. Because at the moment, when they investigate, they're also limited. In my experience, when I engage with labor inspectors, they have to notify employers every time they visit the workplace. And then when they visited the workplace, all employees have been warned that not to engage with labor inspector, but engage with their lawyers instead. So it also limits their power to do their job properly. So meaning this is also a challenge not only from previous government, but with this government, if ever they are sincere in addressing this exploitation, introducing legislation and policies are not enough. The manpower is very important in this aspect.
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully any public servants online, if you can take that message back to home base, we would much appreciate that. Now, Sim, can I ask you, as a recruiter, as an ethical recruiter, are you aware of any intentional connections between recruiters and labor inspectors? How do you know that you're working with good businesses? I mean, how do you choose who you give your services to?
So because we do recruitment and immigration, we have the fortunate ability of being able to sort of get under the hood of companies. So most of the time we're doing their accreditation as well. So as Dennis said, the process is there, but there was no checking. So over the years, I have been accused of being too hard when I've insisted on certain information or documents from employers because, the licensed advisor down the street or someone else did it and they didn't have to provide all of this because I obviously have a code of conduct. I can't just tick the box. I need to make sure that you meet that criteria before I tick that box on your behalf because, I'm held to maybe a different standard to somebody else. So that gave us the ability to be able to see, well, this is a good employer. They do have the resources. They do have the systems there. There is no reason why this company should or shouldn't be allowed to have their accreditation. When we have become aware of that, we've stopped working with employers. And where we have had evidence of things not being right, we also reported it. But like Dennis said, if there's no one on the other end to actually follow through with that process, then nothing happens. So in one instance, we reported something I think it was January or February with regards to some migrant exploitation. That same information regarding the same employer, it wasn't public until Lincoln 10 took it to the media and it was all over the place. And so that really, really long delay identifies that we have some, they're not amazing, but there's still processes and there is a system there to try to reduce it. But if we don't have anyone to then sort of follow through with the application of those parameters, then it's almost not worth the paper it's written on. So you do need the resources to be able to actually follow through and action what's supposed to be done correctly. At least from a government perspective, there's only so much that private businesses will do. At the end of the day, we're a business And so there's only so much that you can do that doesn't result in revenue because we're not funded by anyone. So there is that, the additional responsibility for our institutions to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a state, we have a duty to uphold the law as well as people's human rights. Thank you. Dayle, have you got any thoughts on the what we could better, I suppose, from anything that you've heard from your colleagues? I mean, the access to justice thing is so big. It's not about the justice; it's everybody doing their bit to enable access to justice for our people.
Absolutely. And I think that access to justice really needs to be unpacked quite a lot in terms of, it's one thing to have human rights acknowledged, but they can't be rendered purely symbolic. They have to be able to be exercised, and they have to be able to be monitored and enforced. And if they can't do, then we see the bottoming out of that, where people realize quite quickly that they're not being held accountable. And we start to see this sort of shaving off of where people will go in terms of their compliance. I think for some industries and some business practices, some of the proposals being made are just not sustainable. The business model underpinning them is based on an undercutting of labor costs or an undercutting of human rights, and somebody's making that economic or financial decision at some point, that in order to make a profit in a certain area, they will cut back on wages that are being paid or benefits and entitlements. And if they're relatively confident that nobody's going to check them on that, or that they can take a chance on the balance of probabilities that somebody's not going to notice that, and the migrant workers within that space are also prevented for a wide variety of reasons from accessing ways to remedy that. And this could be a language barrier, could be a geographical limitation on the access to justice. Some of it is that multiple people through the pecking order have got vested interests in some of these, in some of where these schemes have gone wrong. And so even where somebody in that position would appeal to is problematic, exacerbated, as you've pointed out, by the psychological kind of burden that's also woven into this. I mean, a lot of people, basic human dignity and pride is caught up in this, because it's supposed to be the land of milk and honey where people can come for better opportunities, and find themselves unable to even sustain a basic standard of living here, let alone contribute to families and things back home. So I do think the access of justice needs more than just a surface level examination. People have to get under the nitty gritty of that and say, actually, although we've provided a particular pathway, maybe by labour inspectors or other things, how accessible really is that to people that have otherwise been rendered relatively powerless by a system? And I think it's grossly inequitable when, again, the big profits out of some of these industries are on the back of these communities. It's unacceptable.
Yeah, kia ora. And as Dennis said before, even the process itself takes so long. To get a case to the end takes so long. We've got a number of questions. Thank you everybody online for posting the question. Well, I'll do my best to get through some of them. We may not get through all to all of our questions. But can I ask the panel? So one of the questions that's come is, do the panelists think the government understands the scale of exploitation, and are they taking it seriously enough? Dennis, can I come to you?
I can answer that. I don't think so. I don't think so. Because if ever we understand that, then we already introduced legislation, and they already actually increase the number of labor inspectors and provide more power to labor inspectors, and haven't seen that. And that's why I empathize with labor inspectors out there. And now, given that the direction of this government is to reduce the number of public sector employees then I have my doubts that they will truly understand that. I think it's just going to be, they're just going to be scratching the surface. And this is something that I'm really concerned about.
Thank you, Dennis. Nassim, your thoughts?
I actually disagree. I think they do know, and it's just not the same priority. And so there are minor changes to policy to reduce the amount of exploitation, but the amount of resource it needs to completely stamp it out isn't there. So they're not doing that. So, you know, we've had, was it the 7th of April this year? The immigration minister brought in a whole lot of changes that if you look at them closer, you can see it deliberately set to try to change some of the behaviours and to limit the types of people who appear to have been mostly taken advantage of under the AEWV scheme to not have that opportunity moving forward. So RSE aside, because I appreciate that's got a different discussion that's underway, but under the Accredited Employer Work Visa, I think the fact that it was in the media and you couldn't pretend that it wasn't there meant that the government did actually make some changes, and I think those changes have been positive in the sense that, you know, you do need to provide work experience to apply for effectively a skilled role that's under that policy. You're coming to fill a skilled need in New Zealand that can't be filled locally. So that's the intention of that policy. And yes, the AEW was supposed to reduce migrant exploitation by checking employers first, and there is supposed to be additional checks and balances. It just wasn't being done at the time. Since then, the government has completely gone the other way, and they're over-assessing everything to the point where the country is basically at a standstill. So, you know, I think they do know. I just don't know that it's as important for them to deal with, maybe against other priorities.
Can I just respond to that? Because one indication that the government is aware is by them supporting the modern slavery legislation. This government did not support that. And the other one is that the previous government introduced about the accountability of an economic employer. So they have responsibility to ensure that in their supply chain, that they are not actually exploiting their own people. Until now, because of our employment legislation and a lack of accountability in the supply chain, it's so hard to track down exploitation in the supply chain. Because at the moment, the only way you can actually address exploitation is by individual cases. And you cannot actually see the role of businesses right now, even though they have actually ESG responsibility to track down the exploitation in their industry, because there is no such thing as due diligence. What we have right now is just an immigration policy. But I tell you what, as long as there are multi-contractors arrangement in construction industry, as long as anyone can establish their business without a heavily scrutinized about their financial situation, I don't think that those policies will actually be effective. Just actually ask the New Settlers Family and Community Trust, because they have many victims of migrant workers exploitation visa that you can actually relate with their cases.
I think I would partially agree, partially disagree. I think this is known to the New Zealand government, and I think it's been brought to their attention several times. And I think again with the UN Universal Periodic Review, 270 odd recommendations to the New Zealand government to clean up its Human Rights Act. A significant portion of those recommendations are around migrant labour and exploitation, modern slavery. I think it's a little bit like, and this is probably where I've feel some sort of historical deja vu, I suppose, a little bit like Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The government knows what it says. They know sovereignty wasn't ceded, but it suits their power base at the moment to turn willful blindness about those issues because they don't have to confront them. And I think while the government might not understand every single individual case of exploitation, what this government does understand is capitalism. They understand that in and out because their entire system is based on it. And they know capitalism is based on needing certain sectors of the society to rise above in terms of profit margins and those sorts of things. And most often in a capitalist society, there's a strata of society that is oppressed in order to stand that system up. The government are well aware of that. I think what they need is the continued pressure to be accountable for it, because our economy in this country is not sustainable without acknowledging that. And so I think it's political will that's lacking, not transparency around what's going on.
Thank you, Dayle. And in thinking about, we talked about the UN recommendations and calls from other countries. Dennis, can you share your observations of what other countries or what they might be doing? Is there an ideal approach overseas in order to eliminate or identify and eliminate migrant exploitation? Can you give us an example?
I think a couple of things I'd like to say about that. One thing I'm really proud about New Zealand that we have to be proud of and stand tall is family reunification. Every time I attend international conference, we stand out because of this principle that New Zealand actually followed. It's something that we should be proud of. But it seems that every year this is now becoming limited. So that's something that we also should always be watchful and be mindful about because that's an asset for us. In terms of international practice, I think watch out with the Albanese government because they are now planning to pass a legislation how to assist victims of exploitation, more progressive compared to New Zealand. Because, for example, if ever you are a victim of exploitation, from my understanding, you will not only be given a 6 months visa, but you'll be given a year. That is what is being proposed. And I think trade unions, our counterpart in Australia, is optimistic that they'll be able to pass this through to their labor MPs. And in other countries, they're quite relaxed in some of, for example, pathway to residency, like in Australia. And I'm seeing in Canada, they are our biggest competition right now in terms of poaching our skilled workforce. The other one that we have to be mindful is that also they struggle for equity because the pay in New Zealand compared to other countries, we are actually, it's really apart. And you can see that from, for example, St. John ambulance officers, if ever they move to Australia, they move to Canada, they will be paid almost twice of their salary. And I think because of the terms and conditions, some countries are attracting more favorable conditions in order not only to attract migrant workers, but even our own people. So we have to be mindful about those things. And I think I'm going back to Australia right now because they're criminalizing exploiters as well. Something I look forward that wage theft, underpayment, or exploitation should be a criminal act. Something I look forward in the future in this country.
Thank you very much, Dennis. It's certainly, it's something that we think Dayle and you've all talked about, things like remedy, proper redress for these issues, and we do need to go there. We do need to have our laws in a fair process so that our people have access to justice. Now, Sim, what have you seen overseas in terms of things that someone else might be doing better than us to address migrant exploitation through your links?
I primarily obviously work in Australia, so working with companies on both sides of the Tasman. Dennis referred to some of the changes that were actually introduced on the parts of those were introduced on the 1st of July this year in Australia. With regards to the mistreatment of migrant workers. The penalties in New Zealand, or the jail time, is actually potentially longer in New Zealand than it is in Australia, which I think is quite interesting, even though maybe the financial fines might be higher in Australia. So I guess it reflects each government's determination as to how it would hurt or discourage behaviour a different way across both sides of the Tasman. They obviously do have the Modern Slavery Act and its application in Australia, which we don't here, but it's only for companies of a certain size and turnover. And so, and even then, my experience is that the larger the company, the more resource they have internally, the more committed they are to meeting those requirements. So, you know, they have a whole procurement team that, you know, will spend months with you going through the process to make sure that the supply line is clean. It does tick all the boxes. They've done their due diligence. They hand on heart sort of do that and move forward with access to skilled workers that are, you know, not from whichever country that they're looking to be doing the project in. Whereas we don't quite have that in New Zealand. And part of that, I think, is that there is traditionally, and I hope I'm not offending anyone saying this as an Australian that is now a Kiwi, there's always a bigger concern about the cost of things in New Zealand, less so than it is in Australia. And I think that is a barrier to some of the decisions that are made. It's like a cultural thing. And I think that sort of affects the way that some of the laws are passed here and how they're passed in New Zealand, is that we're worried about the cost of being able to do things. And so that can discourage or delay some of the changes that should be made. And so when we're comparing ourselves to Australia, obviously don't have the best record there either, but it's, you know, there are slightly better laws in place to encourage, you know, parts of the population and the business world to behave correctly. And I would hope over time that we would adopt the Modern Slavery Act in New Zealand as well. And then also in future, hopefully as they will in Australia, it doesn't only apply to the biggest people who can afford to do it.
Thank you, Nassim. Dayle, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation, Nassim. And I think, again, from a human rights point of view, human rights shouldn't yield depending on affordability. And I think it's a culture shift that's required in this country in regards to who is deserving of human rights. And I think, you know, probably from the idealistic kind of, you know, sort of career space I come from, we'd like to really enthusiastically say everybody is entitled to human rights and the full expression of those within this country and the enforcement of those. But what we are seeing time and time again is that either it's, whether it be an economic cost, something start to yield or be considered discretionary, and I don't think that can be allowed to be a culture that continues. We need to arrest that problematic culture very soon, if not now, and say across the board, regardless of what country you're coming from or what ethnic background you have, you are fully deserving of the expression of your human rights, and they will be protected and looked after and respected in this country. It's not for a subset of privileged immigrants or privileged people that should be allowed those things. Across the board, basic human dignity should mean a minimum standard, and I think we need to stop seeing those things as nice to have and optional, and those to be considered this is a benchmark of who we are as a country, that we will champion these for everybody and not pick and choose who's deserving.
Absolutely. And I take your point, Nassim, about the worry about costs, costs to businesses. And we forget that there have been costs to the people who have come here. Huge emotional costs, psychological costs, as well as the actual money. And we should actually operate on the benefits of doing right as opposed to the costs of doing right. And, you know, we should do that. We should count that as well. Unfortunately, we don't get to do that often. Now, to our participants and our panelists, this has been a fantastic discussion. And as I said, we would like to have more discussions. And certainly we know that there's a lot happening in this space, but just perhaps not the things that we've talked about today. We want more labor inspectorates. We want more business accountability, and we want to uphold the rights of everybody. And that is our duty here also here at the Human Rights Commission. So with those words, I'm going to end our sessions. Thank you so much. Salamat, Dennis. Thank you so much, Nasim, and kia ora, Dayle, ngā mihi nui, ihoa. And thank you everyone for being here today and for participating in our webinar. The link will be sent out. This has been recorded, so for those who have missed out, please pass it on to them. But thank you again, and I've just got a small, it's a Celtic benediction to close us with, and it's about peace. Deep peace of the running wave to you, deep peace of the flowing air to you, deep peace of the quiet earth to you, deep peace of the shining stars to you, and deep peace of the Son of Peace to you. So be well. Thank you. Thank you for your questions as well.